First off, before I forget it, I do need to pass around the roll and also the assignment list, the presentation assignment sheet. Some of you have not signed up for your presentation yet. Two things before I pass it around. First off, sign up today. If you're not able to sign up with a friend, I'm sorry, but you just have to fill in a blank. I see we don't have anybody signed up yet for one of the presentations that should be done next week, although it's not a real hard one, particularly. However, if indeed we are going to be short on how many students we have in here, that would be one that I can certainly do myself. But if it looks like somebody needs to do it and nobody's wanted to sign up for it, then I will just hold it and have it done later. Because it's not actually sequentially that important that it be done right away. It could even be done last. So sign in someplace and we'll see, even if you're the only name on, for example, Team 2, right now there are no names on Team 2. If you're the only name in Team 2, I'll probably postpone that. I don't expect you to do it by yourself, although I could do it with you. I also need to, like I say, analyze how many students are actually enrolled, see if anybody dropped out, see if anybody's added, and then analyze how many spots we have. So that's the first thing I wanted to note is everybody make sure you're signed up someplace in an actual blank. Be sure, by the way, some of you put in your phone number and your student number, which is nice, but you never put in your name. So you put in your name where you're going to present, so you can kind of see where everybody else put in their names. They kind of wandered around a little bit, but put in your name next to your email address and your phone number if you haven't done that already. But everybody gets signed up someplace, and as I said, if we end up with only one person in Chapter 2 of the media, Understanding Media and Culture, I will make a decision whether to present with that person or postpone that one until we see indeed if some more people are going to show up that haven't shown up yet. So I'll pass that around. The other thing with it, if there are some of you that are actually terrified of presenting and you haven't signed up because you're actually even maybe thinking about dropping out because you're so terrified by the idea of presenting, if you're really, really in that stage, I would let you do what I'm doing right now and record your presentation and do it in your own privacy of your own dorm room or wherever you want to do it. The program that I use is called Screencast-O-Matic, and they have a free version of it that will take you up to 15 minutes anyway. So as long as you're only do a 15-minute presentation, or you can make arrangements to use mine. Anyway, you can just screencast your presentation if you absolutely have to, and your teammates or I can play your video version of you. It's better for you to do it yourselves. We will talk a little more later, even later today, about the importance of public speaking. I think I did already say that it really is critical in your ability to advance in your career. How well you can speak in public will make a lot of difference. It certainly made the difference, and as I mentioned, my CEOs in the engineering firm, I would say that was they didn't maybe take a lot of communication classes, but they were naturally articulate. And so they rose up to the CEO position in their companies, not because they had a lot of communication training, but they were naturally good at least presenting stuff. And they were not the best engineers. And so whatever field you're in, presenting is important. In the field of communications, it's even more important how you can present yourself. It will open up a lot of doors of opportunity that you won't have otherwise. If you, for example, end up in public relations, the same, according to the hundreds of PR executives that I interviewed or surveyed over the years, the skills you get in journalism are almost identical to the skills you need in public relations, the basic skills. There are ways of applying those skills that differ. And so that's why it was quite easy for me to move back and forth between PR marketing and journalism. And in my case, journalism also included being a publisher, which also included being in charge of advertising. So I moved back and forth very easily between those careers. And most of you would find it fairly easy to move back and forth as well, even without additional training in PR, although additional training in PR would be good, and hopefully we will sometime in the next year be able to launch a second major in PR advertising. And it would be wise for you, even if you're majoring in journalism and intend to be a journalist, to take at least one course in PR, just to kind of get an idea of how you adapt your journalism skills to PR. But anyway, PR practitioners, I think I mentioned, are now with more and more regularity moving up, not just within communications, but within corporations. And they're becoming vice presidents. In fact, usually now most sizable corporations have a vice president of communications, because they realize they didn't used to. They didn't realize before how important that was, but now they do realize how important it is, so they move them up into a vice president position, the top communicator, and that person has at least an equal shot of moving up into CEO position as other vice presidents do. So, and very many of them are moving into the CEO position eventually. So anyway, my point is communicating verbally and orally, I guess, so is vital, even if you think of yourself as a print journalist or whatever. It's really vital. Certainly, as we proceed in convergence, which means all of the media converging onto the internet, and that is happening very, very quickly in America, and it will. I have absolutely zero doubt that it's going to spread throughout the world. The trends tend to very frequently start in America and spread through the rest of the country and the rest of the world, globe, I mean. And in this area, it will almost undoubtedly happen. I know I gave a speech at a university in India, and they challenged me on that. Oh, it's not going to happen here. All the newspapers are doing well. No, it's going to. At some point, somebody's going to convince people that it makes more sense to read your newspaper off your mobile device than it does to buy a paper and ink one. And just the economics of it, if it gets to be where a certain percentage, like 50%, certainly 60% of a newspaper's readers are reading it off their mobile device, the economics make it very hard to justify printing it anymore. And so they will move. In fact, even the New York Times. New York Times is the biggest regular newspaper. USA Today is bigger, but other than that, among other newspapers that have a specific city that they identify with anyway, the New York Times is the largest newspaper in America, with, last I saw, about 900,000 subscriptions. But just economically, I have recommended that they stop printing immediately. It costs so much to print and distribute the New York Times that in just 1 year, they could give all of their subscribers a free iPad to replace the printed version. And if they were to offer them a free iPad in order to move online in exchange for like a 3-year subscription, that's my suggestion. Offer them a free iPad and move online, but their free iPad is contingent on them continue to pay for the subscription for the next 3 or 4 years. In America, that's how we pay for mobile phones very frequently, and I see a lot of that's being done here in Malaysia too. That you'll get a really big discount on a mobile phone if you sign up with that mobile carrier, because they're making money off of your actual usage. And so that's more or less what they've been doing in America for decades now. They may even give you a free mobile phone. All you have to do is sign up for 3 or 4 years, and they make their money off of you, and they can enforce that pretty readily. So the New York Times could do the same thing. We won't just give you a free mobile phone, we'll give you a free iPad. They should put in the iPad mobile phone capability, or mobile pad, whatever it is. They should have a one-touch button to take people immediately to the front page of the newspaper, and they would make all sorts of profit, and in those 3 or 4 years, hopefully convince them to renew their subscription. That's the thing that newspapers are scared of, that people won't renew their subscription. And their subscription kind of is their proof to advertisers that their advertising is worthwhile, that people are willing to pay for their newspaper. But anyway, even the New York Times has 900,000 subscribers. Even right now, because of economics, would be better off, I believe, in canceling their printed version. And just saying, if you want the New York Times, you subscribe to our online version, we'll give you an iPad, specialized iPad, customized to them. They should also get into the TV business, also one-touch button to their TV network. They need to think beyond being a newspaper, or they will die along with all the other newspapers, no matter how big they are now. So anyway, getting back, we're going in convergence, we are going into a period of time when everything's going to blend onto the internet. And as you blend on the internet, there's going to be a best practices of journalism on the internet. Best practices is going to be multimedia. There is absolutely no question of that already. That some people like the video, some people like to read. Sometimes it's difficult to contain an entire story in a video format because in a newspaper right now, for example, a good story, especially an in-depth story, an investigative story, anything like that is going to be probably at least 30 paragraphs. The average TV news story is 8 paragraphs. So you see the average newspaper story of any consequence is 4 times as long as a TV story. You don't get near the detail in a TV story as you do in the printed format. And the internet does not change that. It's very easy to put, you can put an entire ebook on for no cost, basically. So the length is no longer relevant even as much as it was or as it is in a newspaper now that we go online. So you can put as much print on it as you want to, because it doesn't cost you essentially anything. So you're going to keep seeing print online, but a lot of people want both, actually. A lot of people prefer the video, but a lot of people really like both. And so I get on, a lot of newspapers now will automatically, even if all they're doing is reading their news story, some of the newspapers are doing that. The Washington Times, that's what they've been doing. They have their printed story and they read the first 8 paragraphs. And then if you want to know more, you keep reading their story. So even if that's all they're doing, that appeals to some of their readers. If they make them distinctive, make them different, include video interviews on their video portion, stuff like that, where you can actually see somebody saying what you said they said, that's much, much, much better. And they will, any real, again, a newspaper or an online news medium is going to go that direction. More TV style video reporting, but still print, or still have the text. So you're not going to get away from those. And you, if you're going to be a reporter, need to be able to be comfortable with both of them, because they don't want to send out 2 reporters in the same story, right? That's not good economics either. And so if you want to be a journalist, you have to become comfortable with the idea that you're going to be doing video and text. How quickly that will become almost, a demand, an actual requirement, I don't know. It might be 10 years, so you might be a ways into your career before you are faced with that. But it's coming. Another thing that's going to, I think I mentioned, maybe not, but in the book that I co-authored last year, one of the conclusions I came to was that the local TV stations are they're about 10 years behind newspapers, that they have just reached what we call a tipping point. Tipping point was when you get to a place where where suddenly something's happened really fast, like tipping over a domino and suddenly all the dominoes fall. You might not think it's happening. The Washington Post, and I should be saving all this for when we talk about newspapers, but let me make my point, I guess. The Washington Post was hiring people, I think it was in 2005. That was their most profitable year ever. And so they were hiring people. They got up to 900 people in their news staff. So again, a very large news staff, a very prominent newspaper. In 2006, they were laying people off. They hit the tipping point in about 2006. They knew it was going to come eventually, but they still were thinking, well, it must be a few years away because we're still making money. 2005, we're all is well, all is well. 2006, the dominoes fell. That's what we call a tipping point. And too many people are not aware of that concept, and including CEOs of newspapers were not aware of that concept. But we reach tipping points, and that's becoming a much more, it's become much more important to understand that concept. In this day and age, with the technologies we have, and we'll talk a lot more about disruptive technology later in the semester, but that concept is very important. And my prediction was that when I wrote that chapter, actually about 2 years ago now, was when we hit our tipping point for local TV stations. In America, local TV is propped up financially by the fact that cable channels have to carry the local TV feed, and they have to pay them for that. And so up to 3 years ago, just like the newspapers, we were doing great in 2005. 3 years ago, local TV stations in America were being sold for the highest price ever because their buyers had no idea what a tipping point was. And so they were paying big bucks because of what I was mentioning, the retransmission fees that the cable stations were providing them. Well, this year, there are now more people watching the online entertainment, such as Hulu and Netflix, than on cable. And that was starting to happen 2 years ago, and it's building momentum to where now cable it does not have nearly as many subscribers as it did, and it will have fewer and fewer and fewer until it becomes economically unviable. And meanwhile, as they recalculate the retransmission fees, the local stations get less and less and less money, and they, just like newspapers in America, have not shown any ability to transfer their advertising to an online format, almost none. And so they're right where the newspapers were 10 years ago. They're going to be dead in another 10 or 15 years, just like newspapers will be dead within the next 10 years. So the TV may hang on just a little bit longer, maybe not, because their costs are higher. So we see these things, and that's going to even push more for moving multimedia onto the internet, because you're replacing TV and you're replacing newspapers. And the best practices will be bring them both in the same place. And if you're going to have a popular news channel, you're going to have both. And you, if you're a journalist, will have to be able to do both. And so be aware of that, prepare for that. Doing presentations up here, therefore, should not be that big of a challenge if you want to be a journalist long term. And the truth is that's going to also, I mentioned, according to PR executives, PR practitioners need the same skills as journalists. That's not going to change. Their skills will change, just like journalist skills will change. Now, will there be a position if some of you are, again, too shy to present? Yeah, there will be some. For example, editors. Editors, one of the main differences between an editor and a reporter is an editor doesn't have to be in public. They do have to be among the best writers. And they would have to learn video editing probably, even if they think their strength is text, and they want to be a text editor, what we might call a print editor now, I guess. They will have to also become a video editor as we converge onto the internet. So they have to do both. So if you want to be an editor, there's still positions for that. You don't have to be in front of the camera then. In fact, The one thing in newspapers in America, they're the last people to be laid off. The editors are the last people laid off, not because they're prominent, not because everybody loves them, but because somebody has to put out the newspaper. You know, you can do with fewer reporters because we have Associated Press and other wire services. You can always have a fewer local stories and put national stories in there that you get from Associated Press. But somebody still has to do that. Somebody still has to paginate the pages and prepare them for print. And so the editors are the last ones to go. Some of the first ones going are the photographers. As their revenues decline, the photographers go out the door first, and they hand a camera to a reporter. Reporters go out next, and they fill their space with Associated Press stories, and the editors are the safest. Editing is a good career too, very good, usually paid a little better and more secure. So those of you who don't want to be in front of a camera, don't want to make appearances, or don't want to have to have the limelight, then you should be an editor. But if you're a shy editor, you're not going to move up to the top of the editor rankings. You're not going to become the executive editor if you can't communicate. So, okay. Anyway, enough with that. But so I will pass this around again. As we approach your time to present, if you again need to do it, really feel like you need to do it by video, I can help you do that. Let me say though that for everybody it's always the first time, and the first time's always hard, and the second time's a little bit easier, the third time's a little bit easier still. The first time I gave a public presentation, I nearly collapsed. I nearly fainted, literally. I wanted, as I mentioned, I wanted to be a communicator. I wanted to share ideas, and so I ran for our student government president position. And as I was getting down, I could feel my knees buckle, and I saved myself. I did not fall. But that was the first time I had to speak in front of a large group, in front of all the students of that school. So for everybody, that first time is scary. And the second time, not so much. Third time, pretty soon, it's old hat. You don't think about it. So, encourage you to do it. Okay, so I'll pass around attendance. So this is class 3. If you miss class, do not put your name in the previous 2 slots. If you miss classes the previous 2 times, here's the presenter sheet. Again, if you do not write your name in, please write your name in wherever else wrote their names in. So I know whose address and phone number that is. Okay, I think I wasn't going to do this first, but I think I will, because your achievement in this class, in part, will be dependent on your ability to take notes. The stories you write, and as you know, those that were here last week or watched my video on Moodle since then, you will not have a final exam in this class. You have a final paper. And so you're going to be writing, but you're not going to be writing academically, you're writing journalistically. And so we're going to talk mostly about your writing today. We talked a little bit about it last week. I'm going to reiterate some of it with a PowerPoint so you can kind of maybe see it visually. We'll have a little discussion on it, and I'll call on some of you to respond to some questions in the class. Get your feet wet in making public presentations with just a 1-sentence response or 2. But note-taking, especially as any sort of a journalist, as a TV journalist as well, you need to make sure you have all the information you need for your story. Even if you have done video already, some of what you need, you may have them put in video format. Like the very first thing you do when you do the video for a newscast is probably, please state your name, your position, so you have that information with you, and you don't walk off and forget to get somebody's name. So you get some of the basics in the video itself. That'll be edited out, but you want to make sure you have it. With a newspaper man, obviously you need to make sure you know who you're talking to, and you say, well, you set up an interview, and you know who, no, not necessarily. You may be talking to people off the street. You may be at the scene of a fire, and there may be firefighters running over the place, and you're trying to catch one of them to talk to them about the fire. There's lots of situations where you may not have the name of the person you're talking to. Here, you guys are going to be presenting, and you maybe don't know everybody's name. And so somebody gets up here, two things are important. First off, if you present, please put your name up on your PowerPoint. If there's 3 of you presenting, before you start your section, put your name up in the PowerPoint so everybody can write down your name. Don't make people have to guess at that, because you can't write a story without the names of your sources. If you don't have the names of your sources, you can't use that information, basically, as a journalist. That you look like an idiot if you put in, according to, what do you say, an anonymous source. Today's Tuesday. They had to have secrecy to tell you that. You have to get people's names. So please, as presenters, make sure that your name is on the PowerPoint. That as you start. In fact, it would be not great if your name's on every slide of your PowerPoint. So anybody who's asleep with your first PowerPoint will still get it in the second PowerPoint slide. So just help each other out here, okay? Helps me out too, so I don't get confused, but it helps all of you out because you need to know who you're attributing to. I mentioned earlier, and it's in the critique sheet that I've given you, that we reviewed the other day, that in essence, in news writing, almost every paragraph is attributed. There are some exceptions, and I'll talk about one major exception today, later. But in almost every case, you want to make sure that people don't think you're writing an essay. This is not your profound thoughts. As a reporter, you are reporting on what other people say. Now, we're pretending in this class that as you present, you guys are experts. You don't have to, as a writer, make up why they're an expert. You can just quote them, that's fine. Maybe for me, you can add a little bit of reasons why I'm an expert in the field. But we're pretending that every class is part of a conference that's being held here at Xiamen. And so you're reporting on the conference, and all of you are experts at that conference. And I'm an expert at the conference. So you have to take notes to be able to quote us. Now, there are 2 types of quotes, direct quote and indirect quote. We talked about that the other day. Direct quote, how do you know it's a direct quote? Yeah, quotation marks, yeah. So that says this is essentially exactly what was said. Now, in truth, what we find in actual practice, direct quotes are not always exactly direct quotes. They're not exactly. But my rule of thumb is it should be close enough that the person you're quoting won't know. They won't know that you missed a word or two. And a few days later, they won't know. Unless they're reading a script, they won't know. Now, if they're reading a script, they might know. But even then, as long as you got the essence of what they said, they won't care, right? If you got one word wrong, you replaced it with another word, they won't care. They're not going to be looking for that sort of thing. So as long as the essence is accurate and the words are close to accurate, nobody cares. And in fact, as editors and as reporters, you sometimes change it on purpose to correct people's grammar. I know I speak sometimes, I speak and I throw in bad grammar when I speak sometimes, because my mind is thinking something and then I shoot off to something else, and the grammar falls in between. And all of you will do the same thing. Some of your speech you'll be using bad grammar. So should we quote your bad grammar? No, we shouldn't. We should do you the favor of correcting your grammar. So in that case, we're purposely lying about that this is a direct quote. But it's a polite change. And it's the essence is the same, most of the words are the same, we've corrected your grammar, all is fine. Okay, so that happens all the time in professional journalism. So you don't get too hung up on it. On the other hand, if you realize you are really guessing at this thoroughly, it's not just one word or 2 words, but you are totally, not sure about the quote, then don't call it a direct quote. It's an indirect quote then. And you put it into your words. You maybe change it even a little more to make sure that it's your words and not their words. So don't get too hung up on that it has to be word perfect. It has to be close. It has to be essentially accurate. Some of the words, most of the words have to be accurate. But a few words, like I say, you might even change on purpose. So that's okay. As you take notes, one of the first things is that you're listening, you hear a good quote, try to capture it in your mind and write it down quickly while you're only kind of half listening to the next part of the presentation or interview or speech or whatever it happens to be. The key here is what I found with many beginning reporters in the real world, and certainly among students who are going out and doing a real assignment, is that they will start writing down a direct quote. And suddenly they will hear something else, and they'll abandon the first direct quote, and they'll go to another direct quote. They'll start writing it, and they'll hear something else. They'll abandon the second direct quote, and they'll go on to a third one. They'll write half of that one, and they'll abandon that one and go to the fourth one. Writing a news story is like building a house. You need all the bricks. Your bricks in this are your quotes. Your quotes and indirect quotes. You kind of blend the two. As I said before, I go about 40% direct quotes and the rest indirect quotes, paraphrases, summaries, so forth. But you need some direct quotes to really make it go smoothly and to seem authoritative. To me, a direct quote is kind of like the video in a TV report. This is what the person really said. Now, can you take a video out of context? Absolutely. You could take a video interview and splice out, and have just the part you want and make anybody look like an idiot. And so you can report unfairly even with video. Accurately and unfairly. They are different because you can take people out of context what they're trying to express. You can do the same thing in print. Just because you're accurate does not mean you're fair. And that you've really said what they meant to say. That you've really expressed it, even though you're word perfect. So make sure that you get it within context anyway, and that's one reason why some of it has to come in indirect quote form. You're not going to get it all. But again, that's the most important thing, that somebody doesn't feel like you quoted them incorrectly, and and for me, if it's inaccurate, if I'm sure that you're quoting somebody inaccurately, that's going to be a problem for your grade. You have to be accurate in the information, even if I think you're off a little bit on the words, but the information, the essence of what they said is accurate, I'm going to overlook that probably. Unless it's really, like I've had some quote me and I said nothing about what they said I said. Well, then that's going to be a ding. Because you have to be somewhere in the ballpark. In some cases, like I said, they've actually quoted me saying something I never talked about. And so you're way out, that's a problem. So don't do that. So anyway, this idea of kind of listening and half listening is to make sure you get enough direct quotes for your story. Your story really only needs no more than 8 good direct quotes. And that may actually be more than you need, but some you will decide later you don't really fit into your story, so you leave them, you don't use them. So you might only actually use 5 direct quotes in your story. So you collect 8, you throw 3 away, you use 5 of them. It should not be hard in 4 hours of class to come up with 5 quotes to cover 1 week. And now we're only writing this every few weeks. So getting enough quotes should not be a problem unless you do what the beginners do and you get half quotes. Now you can use partial quote sentences, but again, if you use too many of them, it becomes too obvious that you're getting the start of quotes and you're not getting the end of quotes, then you look like an idiot. So you don't want to do that. So it's really important to understand no reporting is perfect. No reporting is perfect. No matter how strong a professional you are, no reporting is perfect. And you will not get everything. You will not even get all of the best stuff. It's ironic to me a little bit, perplexing a little bit, But I asked, in a survey, I asked editors if they wanted their future reporters to learn shorthand. Shorthand is what secretaries use to take down dictation. They probably don't use it much anymore because they use a tape recorder and dictaphone or whatever, and they can transcribe that way. But in the old days, secretaries had a way of writing in a short form that they could keep up with their boss or whoever they're trying to take down information from. And so back in those days, I did ask editors, would you like reporters to know shorthand so that they can take down notes more accurately and faster? They said no. No, because first off, they don't have time to use all that information anyway. They're coming into the newsroom, they have to write their story quickly. They consider that your note-taking is part of your editing process in a sense. You will get the most important stuff, and so you have less material, and you can write your story faster. You get too many notes, you can't write very fast. And so they actually don't want you to have perfect notes, which is, like I said, kind of, to me, kind of almost alarming that they would say that. But that's what they say. The vast majority said, no, we don't want perfect notes. We just want you have to learn how to take notes, take it at your speed, and make sure you have some accurate quotes. Make sure you have the overall information accurately, but we don't want you to be perfect. And we don't want you to take too much time. You're in a hurry. You've got a lot of work to do. So understand that. Understand you're not going to be perfect. You're not going to be complete. You will miss out on some important stuff even. You will in this class, and you will as a professional. That's just the way it is. So make sure you have the bricks. Make sure you have some direct quotes and you listen long enough to get the entire quote. And even if you miss the next quote, that's okay. You'll have some quotes, somebody else have some quotes. If you're kind of half listening, you can very quickly write down a note, an idea of what was said after that, and that's an indirect quote then. You can build off that little idea. I interviewed one award-winning journalist who was a good enough investigative reporter that he sent a number of people to prison with his investigative reporting. And because of the nature of his reporting, he never took notes in front of them. He wanted to be able to look them in the eyes and talk to them. And he had a very kind of disarming way of talking and of asking questions anyway. He was describing that he would go into somebody, like he had an interview with the head of a labor union who had been siphoning off funds for himself, using the union's money for himself. And he went in there, and his approach to the interview was something like, it's embarrassing to have to ask you this stuff, but there's been accusations, and it's only fair that I ask you so that you can respond to it. I'm sure that you're innocent, very disarming, but how do you respond to people who say that you stole money from the union? And he said, I didn't. You steal any money? I don't know. He says, yeah, well, that's kind of what I thought too, except you know what? Your accountant said that, he has these receipts from when you went to Cambodia and with your secretary, and you didn't have any reason to go there, and you spent all this money from the union. What were you doing there? He has to answer that. Anyway, just gradually, he had the information. He knew he had all the details to nail him, so to speak, and he just gradually made it tougher and tougher. And he's talking about this union leader. Actually, after he went to prison, used to send him Christmas cards. He still thought they were friends. He didn't realize he had been conned into confessing, in essence. So it's in his case, he did not want to be taking notes in front of the person he was trying to send to prison. And so he would just listen very carefully, and then he would leave. Once he left the interview, he would go sit in a stairwell or whatever and take notes down very furiously from his recollection. Now, in his case, he would use very few direct quotes. It would be mostly indirect quotes for what he was doing. But that was because of the nature of his reporting, and that's what he chose to do. He took no notes on the spot, but he depended on his memory and then went and took notes. You can also do some of that, by the way, is that you take notes in this class. As soon as class is over, if you have a few minutes, write down the other stuff that you missed that you can still remember. And don't wait until later when you need to use it for the story and, oh, you forgot. So, you can extend your note-taking beyond the class. When it comes down to some details that are not direct quotes, you can still do that. So think about that too. As I said, be pragmatic. Understand that you won't have time to take down all the notes you would like. It's better off to have a half dozen complete quotes than 2 dozen half quotes. I sometimes, and I'm getting to this in a second, and I'm kind of telling the story before I get to the notes here. This will be on the Moodle site for your review. But sometimes, as I'm going to get to, and I may not go down this list altogether because of that, sometimes I do use a tape recorder. In fact, I've used a tape recorder a lot in my career, partly because a lot of my career I've been a weekly newspaper reporter rather than a newspaper reporter, editor, publisher, rather than a daily newspaper reporter. I don't have the timelines, the time deadlines that a daily reporter would have. And so I want a more complete report than they have. And so that's one reason. The other reason is sometimes I am in interviews that I think somebody might try to deny with public officials. I've gotten basically rid of 2 mayors of big cities by them telling me stuff that they shouldn't have told me, and then being embarrassed and denying it later, and then I being able to say, he did say that, and you can come listen to the recording if you wish to. This day and age, I can put on the internet. I did that with a third person, not a mayor, but she was a county official. And she started lying about what she said, so I put her entire interview on the internet and said, she's lying, and here's the proof. Come listen to her entire interview if you want to. So that's one reason why I do that. I also do that, and I use it in a different way than the daily reporter probably could do. And that is, I take notes typically also, and then I use the notes as kind of like my table of contents for the audio recording. And so now I can see, okay, somewhere about 1/3 of the way through my interview, he talked about this. That's a really important topic. So I go find that in tape recording, and I get that 100% accurate because it's the most important thing he was talking about. So it might only be 2 or 3, 4, maybe 5 minutes. 5 minutes is a lot of quotes. So I'm probably not going to transcribe more than 5 minutes from any location anyway. But I can use my notes, and most of the story I use from my notes, but I go to my recording for the key parts that I realize, that's the part I really want to emphasize. I want a bunch of direct quotes there. And so I go to my tape recorder, transcribe a couple of minutes, and I'm ready to go. The other thing is if I think somebody's going to not talk to me, or they say they won't talk to me. I've gotten, in many cases, I hook up my audio recorder to my telephone, and I call somebody up and say, I ask them a question, and they say, I'm not going to talk to you about that. And then they go ahead and talk about that, like 2 or 3 sentences only. But I have those 2 or 3 sentences that they said they wouldn't say. They said, as part of their defense for not saying anything, they said something. And so I have those 3 or 4 sentences that I can put in my story. And I say 5 or 6 sentences are great. If you have 5 or 6 good, solid sentences, that makes it, that's okay for a story. And so he just gave me 3 sentences and said he wouldn't say anything. Okay, fine, you didn't say anything, all right. But he still is in the newspaper because I didn't say I wouldn't quote him. And he gave me quotable material. So there's lots of reasons why you might use a tape recorder. And if you use one in this class, do it the way I said. Take notes. Consider where in that recording, what's the most important thing I talked about or somebody else talked about. Go find that spot, transcribe, a couple of minutes. A couple of minutes are probably 5 quotes right there. A couple of maybe 6, 7, 8 quotes in 2 minutes. So get those quotes out of that spot. Let me see if there's anything else. I'm kind of, like I said, covering a lot of stuff here all at once. Again, indirect quotes and paraphrases are essentially the same thing. So I use them like synonyms. So whatever you don't get exactly quoted, and you're not comfortable with how closely you got the quoted, go ahead and call it, don't put quote marks, use it as a paraphrase. And the paraphrases, again, I mentioned the other day, kind of help guide your story from one idea to another idea. You can't do that with direct quotes because you can't put words in their mouth, so you can't use transitions very well in the direct quotes. And so it's your indirect quotes or your paraphrases that allow you to make transitions from one idea to another idea. I gave you an example the other day. I don't remember what it was, but let's say you're interviewing me, or I'm talking about changes in, well, let's say I was just talking about what I was talking about, the changes in the news media. And so I say that the news media are dying. Okay, so you quote me in that. Then I get off and talk about the economics. Well, you can transition then with your indirect quote to the economics of what's causing them to die and why they're going to die faster, why TVs are, he also says that TV stations are going to die as well, that they've just reached their tipping point. That's your transition. Now you talk about TV. So you just use the indirect quotes or the paraphrases to help guide from one idea to another idea. Your direct quotes you can't change that much, so they can't be a transition. Okay, everybody get signed in. So that can't be a transition. So your indirect quotes, your paraphrases are essential, and that's why I just kind of plan on going from indirect quote to direct quote to indirect quote to direct quote. My indirect quotes are guiding the reader through to the direct quotes. The direct quotes are the authority, they're credible, this is exactly what they said, and then indirect quote to the next idea, and this is exactly what he said. Indirect quote to another idea, this is exactly what he said. And so I just interweave the two. So anyway, I think those are the main things you need to remember for this. I will post this onto the website in all its detail, but it's more or less what I just said. So I'll close that. So again, I think like with a lot of things, don't get freaked out over this. This is not too hard. Taking these notes and writing. In fact, journalistic writing is the easiest writing because you don't have to say anything profound. You let other people say things that are profound. You don't have to say anything profound. You're just the writer. You're the reporter. So of all types of writing, the easiest writing of all is journalistic writing. You don't have to have your own ideas. You don't have to have, you don't have to be profound. You're just quoting. All you have to do is figure out, get those quotes, put them in some sort of reasonable order, make transitions between them, voila, you're done. So once you get used to journalistic writing, it's the easiest writing of any. And as you get used to it, as I said, you can use the same technique to a large degree with other types of writing. If you're writing an essay for a composition course, an English course or something, you can use this style. Instead of direct quotes that you're getting from an interview, you're getting direct quotes from a book or something, and you're interweaving between one direct quote and one, authoritative source to another authoritative source, but your indirect quotes are guiding through from these quotes from, library books or whatever. You can still use the same approach, as I do in my academic writing. So I do the same thing. Whether I'm writing for an academic book or for a news story, I pretty much use the same style. Okay, don't need that. So let's go back and cover a little bit of the approach to news writing. Just reinforce that before I kind of give you start asking some of you questions here. So first off, what is news? Now we're kind of faking this news in here. It's a fake conference, but I want it to be as realistic as possible. I want you to write the stories as if you're writing them to somebody who's not in this class. That's what you do as a journalist. So you're not writing it for me. You're writing it to some friend in another major. They don't know what happened in this class. Make it interesting to them, make it accurate to them, make sure it's understandable to them. Make sure you don't take something that out of context of the class, that if somebody out of the class reads it, they have no idea what you're talking about. Okay, you have to give them enough details, make sure they understand. Because I'll be reading it that way. I'm the editor, so to speak. I'm used to being an editor. And so I see that stuff. I think that way. I think, how would I understand what this person's writing if I knew nothing about this subject? An editor has to think that way. And so I've been an editor for decades. I'm going to think that way. So you need to write as if you're writing to somebody not in this class, because I will grade it that way. I will read it that way. So, but beyond that, you start thinking what's important. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are some of the news values if you're actually a reporter. Some of the things that are really important. The things that are at the very top to me that I would emphasize, that I would suggest you need to emphasize in your writing for this class. First off, consequence. Ask yourself, so what? You know, look at all your notes, so what? What's in here that matters? What's in this that's interesting? It relates very closely to curiosity too. So somebody not in this class might be curious about how newspaper people work. So there's something in here that somebody outside this class might be interested in because they didn't know this. They didn't know why the newspapers why they lost 2/3 of their advertising. They didn't know they were going to disappear. They didn't know that they're going to all converge onto the internet. They don't know this stuff. So for them, curiosity is part of it, but also consequence. We're not going to have printed newspapers in the future, says Dr. Ken Harvey. And so why? He's curious. So you answer his curiosity and the consequence. He won't have a newspaper to read in the future. What's he going to have to know what the news is? So you tell him then where the news is going to go and why it's going there. So it's, by the way, somebody asked me if the material last week should end up in the story, and I think I erroneously said no, because if we're thinking of this as a conference for professional communicators, then there were things like how to write the news story that were relevant last week. So if you have notes from last week, that's fine. I'm kind of reviewing it again right now. But this could be part of your story, because I'm talking about how news stories are written and how news writers think, how they do their job. And that does become relevant to the conference that we're having for professional communicators at Xiamen University, according to our story. So some of these other things are important for news writers, news reporters, but particularly those first two for this class. But even for, well, it's at the top of the list for all news reporters. Those are the things at the top of my list for all reporters. I was my first job out of the university. I started as a reporter, and then within 6 months became editor of a newspaper. I think I mentioned it. It was 120,000 circulation in Tampa, Florida. There were 2 daily newspapers competing with us, plus lots of TV stations and stuff. Ours was a free newspaper, and so as I mentioned last time, I had to make it as interesting as possible. I had to have consequence and curiosity, or people would not read our newspaper. There was why they had habits already of reading the daily newspaper. So why would they read this new newspaper that's thrown on their doorstep? Why would they waste their time with it? So I had to get people talking. I had to create buzz. This was decades ago, before we had the word buzz. But I had to create buzz. I had to get people talking about our newspaper. And so I did do controversial stories and very interesting stories. A lot of consequence, a lot of curiosity in the stories that I was going after. But I found one of the things I would do is I'd go through the daily newspaper stories, and they're always in such a hurry. They did a really good job of giving the who, what, when, and where, and never getting to the how and why. And so I would be able to, in some cases, just go to the stories of the daily newspapers, because they were coming out every day and I'd come out every week. So I had a few more days to work on it. I'd read their story with the who, what, when, where. I'd copy all that information, and I would go do a quick interview and find out the how and why. How did this fire happen? How did it spread? How did it impact people? Why wasn't the fire put out more quickly? Why didn't you respond faster? Why and how questions were the things that I emphasized all the time. And I could make the daily newspaper editor or newspaper reporters look stupid, only because they were in too big of a hurry to answer those two questions. And those are the two most important questions. And so in this class, it's, over the years, I've kind of become a specialist in writing stories about why and how. Those are the two most interesting ones, the most important ones. And in this class, you should be listening to things like that. How will things happen? Why will they happen? And those are the quotes you should really go after. Those are your leads. Those are your first paragraph sort of quotes. As a news reporter, pursue. You want to get all those answers. And like I said, the how and why are the ones that most reporters fail to get. In this class, listen for that. You don't have to go out and do extra reporting, but listen for it in this class. I mentioned already, accuracy, but not too much accuracy. Don't get anal about it. And so we want everything to be credible, and to be credible, you have to be accurate, but not, like I said, as I said, not necessarily word perfect accurate. A few words can be off as long as the essence is there. I'm not going to worry about it. And as a professional, you won't be word perfect accurate either. I've done enough. Even when I don't use a recorder, the only people I've ever said that I did bad reporting were those who I also tape recorded, and I knew I did accurate reporting. The only people who have ever called me a bad reporter are those that did that because I was a good reporter, because I nailed them. Everybody else has always said in fact, they're very frequently come and rave about my reporting. How did you get all this information so accurately? Time after time, people have come to me and said that, even if I don't use a recorder. And so I'm a very accurate reporter, and I take pride in that. But I myself have looked at my notes and then gone in and compared that with the tape recording and realized I was quite a ways off. But I wasn't so far off that they noticed. So my sources didn't notice, but in comparing my notes, what I wrote down they said, and then comparing it to what was on the tape recorder, I was a long ways from being word perfect. So as I said, the source didn't know that. They raved about how accurate I was, but I knew it. I knew I was off. So anyway, be as accurate as you can, but don't get anal about it. And we already talked about tape recorder versus notes. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. Make everything simple. Again, we talked about that, but let me emphasize it again. As a reporter, as a journalist, that's our main. That's one of the main aspects of our writing. We want that 14-year-old to be able to understand what we're talking about. If we're talking about nuclear physics, whatever, that 14-year-old has to understand what we're talking about. So we have to keep it simple. So we want to use simple words. I mentioned the other day, do you know what a compound sentence is? Anybody want to define what is a compound sentence? Anybody know? A compound sentence is basically two sentences in one, usually divided by a comma. Now, there's two types of compound sentences. Both types of compound sentences are going to have a verb in both halves of the sentence. And some, by the way, when you get really bad, you'll have a compound sentence with 3 clauses or 4 clauses. I do it myself when I get in a hurry. You definitely don't want to do that. But frequently we do that, especially in our speaking. We never stop a sentence in our speaking sometimes. So that's another reason not to quote exactly, because we never end a sentence. We just go on and on and on. But a compound sentence always should have an independent clause. An independent clause is going to have a subject, a verb, and object. The second clause may not have a subject. So, for example, I went to Washington and saw my children. Okay, that is a compound sentence. I went to Washington, and I did something else, and I saw my children. But that's a case of a complete clause. I went to Washington. The independent clause, the dependent clause is and saw my children is dependent on the subject of the first one. So its subject is I also. So I went to Washington and I saw my children. Now I just said it in two independent clauses. I went to Washington and I saw my children. Now that's two sentences in one with a comma in between. In either case, it makes your sentence longer, but particularly and there's not in that case not a significant difference between an independent, you're having a second independent or a dependent clause because it's the same subject. I went to Washington and I saw my children. I went to Washington and saw my children. It's in essence the same, just whether or not I put the subject into the second clause. This is the difference between whether it's the second clause is independent or dependent. Did I put a subject in it? Now, when we start writing complicated sentence structures, it's usually we're using compound sentences. We're using more than one clause. Those clauses have their own verbs. They may or may not have their own subjects, but they have at least their own verb. That makes them a clause. In journalistic writing, wherever we can, we break those apart. I went to Washington. I spent time with my children. Now that's a very short compound sentence. So that's an example one you probably wouldn't break in half. That's too short, too easy to follow, especially if it's the second clause is dependent. I went to Washington and saw my children. That's a very short sentence. There's no reason to break that in half. But when you're writing, you're going to get much longer compound sentences than that. Two things happen there. First off, they're long. And the longer they are, and actually, again, as I said, it's not too infrequent that writers, including myself, will add another clause and make it 3 clauses in one sentence, or even 4. Now it's much too long. There's absolutely no excuse for having, as a journalist, having a 4-clause sentence. No way. So that definitely should break into half. But possibly more than in half, possibly into 3. You start looking for those verbs, you start breaking them into smaller pieces to make it easier to read and easier to skim. There's another reason why you do that. When we change clauses, when we change to another clause, sometimes we throw off our reader as to who is the subject or who is the object. We can kind of get mixed up and ourselves, we may do it totally inaccurately, or even if we're accurate, or we think we're accurate, we still confuse them. So who did this? We have these, like I say, a string of clauses together. What was the subject? By the time you get to the end, you're not sure what the subject was. Or in the subject you mentioned your children, by the time you get done with the sentence, you're not sure who you're talking about anymore. So the longer your sentences go, the more likely you're going to make a mistake in the use of your pronouns, or perhaps the use of your verbs. You may start off with a plural subject, and by the time you get done with your compound sentence, you're using a verb, a singular verb, instead of a plural verb, because you've got yourself confused. So for lots of reasons, keep those sentences short. Make sure there's no confusion. When I go through as an editor, that's the first thing. If I have to stop, and I do this when I grade your papers, if I have to stop and ask myself, what's she talking about here? Who's the subject or who's the object? What's this pronoun, this him or them? What's it referring to? If I have to ask myself, that means it's not clear. I should not have to, as an editor or as a teacher, I should not have to stop and ask myself that question. If I am stopping to ask myself that question, that means that's not clear writing. That's not simple writing. And so you may get dinged for it in your grade, but more importantly, as a professional, you may get dinged for it by your editor. You might get fired for it by your editor if you do it too much. So keep things simple, and it's better grammatically. It's better. It's easier for the reader to skim. There's all sorts of reasons to keep things simple. Use simple words. If you have the choice, don't say state, and you can say says. You know, states, says. Use says. As I said the other day, avoid any verbs of attribution that have any connotation that might throw somebody off. Says and states have no connotation. They're just attribution. Again, we usually don't say states. We just say says, and the reader doesn't even notice it. Once you use anything else that has, you know, claims, suggest it might not be true, question, obviously, suggests it may not be true, or raises a question, whatever. There's, you know, other verbs of attribution typically have some connotation. According to, you should use that attribution more for documents than for people. There are journalists, and I myself sometimes use according to for an indirect quote. I wouldn't use it for a direct quote, I don't think. I shouldn't, but you know, I may get in a hurry too. But according to should not be a direct quote, and a lot of editors say it shouldn't be a quote at all, not from a person. A person says, a source is according to. A website, a book, and a competitor, according to this other newspaper, this and this, whatever. Don't try to use a lot of adjectives to impress me. I'm never impressed by adjectives that are not immediately visible in my mind. Brilliant is not visible in my mind. Outstanding, not visible in my mind. This is an opinion. Those are opinion sort of adjectives. Be very, very careful with them. And if you're going to use one, you make sure that you follow up with the evidence that is true. Instead of saying that, you know, the outstanding professor from America, say, you know, the professor who has been the author, who authored 4 books. You know, be specific. What is making? Why do you think he's outstanding? Don't just throw it in there because you thought it'd sound cool. Don't do that. So watch out for your adjectives and your adverbs. Anything that requires you to express an opinion that you can't support. Make sure you can support any adjectives or adverbs that you happen to use. As shown up here, you know, work, vocation, employment, all perfectly good synonyms. Keep it simple. You know, there's nothing wrong with work. That doesn't mean you don't ever use the other words, but the norm is let's keep it simple. Eliminate any empty phrases such as needless to say. But if it's needless to say, don't say it. Needless to say, cut it whole thing out. If it's needless to say, cut the whole sentence out. If it's needless to say, but don't say those. Don't use those sorts of phrases. Don't say. In Kazakhstan, they love the word. What was it? Moreover, I think. I have to think about it, but somehow it equates. It's a synonym for something in Russian that they would always say. So they'd start probably in a news story 4 or 5 times, say moreover, or maybe there's another word than that, something like that. Moreover, it's some word that's absolutely not necessary, that somehow translated from something that they thought was necessary and wasn't. So watch out for any words like that. Throw them out. Any words that are not, think at every word you have in there, and anything that's not necessary, that's not helpful, get rid of it. We don't need it. With paragraphs also, in journalism, the standard is that 3 sentences is the most you have in a sentence, and 1 sentence is okay in a paragraph in journalism. In news reporting, they frequently have every sentence separated because that's also easier for the anchor person or the news reporter to read. So they're all separate sentences. In print, we make them separate for another reason, is that our paragraphs are about that narrow. 3 sentences in a narrow paragraph, or a narrow column, I meant to say. 3 sentences in a narrow column makes a long paragraph, visually, makes a long paragraph. And we don't want to scare readers away. So when we're trying to entice them to skim us and to go through and not be intimidated by what we're doing, we want very short paragraphs. Even a one-sentence paragraph will end up being 3 lines, a 3-line paragraph in a 2-inch column. And so that's why we have no problem with a 1-sentence paragraph. By routine, I never put an indirect quote or paraphrase in the same paragraph with a direct quote. Always a separate paragraph. And so that's just absolutely, like I said, there's nothing wrong with a 1-sentence paragraph, so I never put the two together. So indirect quote, new paragraph, direct quote. Indirect quote, new paragraph, direct quote. And I never, ever, ever, that I can think of, ever is a long time, but I never put 2 sources in the same paragraph of a journalistic writing. So if I change sources, and suddenly you're quoting me and then you're quoting a student presenter, new paragraph immediately. Don't put 2 people in the same paragraph, 2 sources, 2 attributions. So keep the paragraph short. It's better for skimming. And so if you're ever going to, well, even on the internet, very frequently the paragraphs are kept narrow, even on the internet. So, short sentences and short paragraphs, both. So 1 to 3 sentences maximum, 3 sentences in a paragraph. That's it, maximum. And not very often 3, usually 1 or 2, and then go to a new paragraph. And look for those reasons to make a new paragraph. Direct quote, indirect quote is a reason to break a paragraph. Different source, reason to break a paragraph. Even if you have, let's say you've used your tape recorder and you suddenly, or you've gone on Moodle and you have my recording, my video, so you can write down, 4-sentence direct quote. Break it into 2 paragraphs anyway. Even though it's 1, I said it all at the same time. Go ahead and you got 4 sentences of direct quote from me, break it into 2 paragraphs. You might even put in an indirect quote in between them anyway. Put in a paraphrase in there and make a transition, or even if not, you can have 2 sentences of direct quote from the same source on the same subject. Paragraph short, that's the rule. Keep the paragraph short. Again, going back to like how and why and so forth, you're looking for what will make your story distinctive and interesting. And that's going to be the thing that you think is most interesting is your lead. That's what you're going to emphasize in your lead. And so you're looking for that in your notes. Don't just take the first thing that jumps into your mind and make a lead out of it. You're going to get penalized for that, almost certainly. Because it's the best thing that for the lead is the most important sentence in your story for 2 reasons. 1, because it's what captures your reader's attention. The second one, because it guides your story and it kind of sets the stage for the rest of your story. A lead leads into the rest of the story. So 2 things about that. First off, make sure that it's representative of the rest of your story. So it's the most interesting thing, but make sure you have other information to support it. So if I say something like, the New York Times should cancel their print, and I don't say anything else about it. I don't give you any reasons why the New York Times should cancel its printed edition. That can't be your lead. You have to have a reason, and you have to make your story follow that lead and tell me why the New York Times should cancel its printing. Now, I may have said it and you didn't catch it. If you didn't catch it, you can't use it. It's got to be in your notes someplace. You've got to know why I said they should cancel their print edition. And so the lead has to be interesting. The lead also has to lead into the rest of your story. It has to be representative of what's the most interesting subject that you're talking about. And you have to have another few paragraphs of information about that lead. Otherwise, don't use it. So there have been times when I've looked at my notes and I've said, why didn't I ask some more questions? Because I found something in my notes that was very interesting and I did not follow up. Now that doesn't happen very often, but there have been times when I've done that, that I suddenly realized after the interview that I failed to ask follow-up questions. In my interviewing, You may go in with a list of questions you want to cover, but that's, as a real reporter, you need to also be extremely flexible and be ready to jump on something like that. You hear something that's interesting, it's not in your list of questions, you have to, on the fly, add some more questions. If you don't, you're a bad reporter. So there have been times when I've been a bad reporter. I thought I had a good angle. I thought a story still came out good, but I realized there was something that I should have followed up on that could have been better, or even a different story, perhaps. Had 2 stories out of 1 interview, maybe. So what I call that key point, that most important element, is the whammy. Probably more people call it the hook. The same thing. I call it the whammy. You hit somebody over the head, you drag them into your story, you get your reader into your story, and so they'll read it. Hook, same thing. I put in here 30 words, but I put elsewhere 35 words, no more than 35 words. Your lead, 1 sentence, 1 paragraph, 1 sentence, 35 words at the most. There are leads that can be shorter than 15 words. And I'll show you some examples of that. But what you want them to be quite short. This one here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Right on 15. In the old days, and many reporters still have not learned their lesson, have not had good teachers, apparently. Many reporters still, but in those days even more so, try to cram too much information, too many of the 5 W's into their lead. And so they get a lead like this long, or longer, sometimes longer than 35 words, that says essentially the same thing, but with more detail. But it's not as interesting as if you can shorten it up and leave some of the detail for paragraph 2. That's where the idea of the complete lead came along. Is we don't need all 5 W's in paragraph 1 if we put the rest of them in paragraph 2. And so that's not a universal thing, but I strongly, strongly, strongly believe that's best practices, is make your lead short, finish the 5 W's in paragraph 2. So you have a complete lead, 2 paragraphs. But your lead, per se, is your first paragraph. You want it extremely interesting. It may not have all the details. So this one, this was when I was doing the bilingual newspaper. Migrant education, I think I mentioned the other day, is the migrant students have the hardest time in public schools in America because they don't speak the language. They're traveling all the time. They are not in any one place consistently. So they 50% of them drop out. So anyway, I was writing about that. And Dr. Richard Gomez, the state migrant education program director, says the achievement gap is closing in Washington State, but still has a long ways to go before students of ethnic origin catch up with white students. Okay, that is not a bad lead for the old days. In this day and age, when we're trying to help people, we're competing with so many other news sources, and we're trying to help them to skim. We're trying to help them decide quickly whether they want to read the story at all. This is the better version. We leave out the name of the person. We put that in paragraph 2. We leave out a lot of stuff. We're using just his reference as what his position is, because people maybe didn't know his name anyway. So the name you can give to him later. So the achievement gap, and we're also pushing the most important part to the front. That's what he said, not who said it. So we're pushing what he said to the front. So most people in America know what the achievement gap is. That's the gap between the different ethnic groups and so forth. The achievement gap is closing in Washington State, says the state migrant education program director. So we give the most important part to the start of the sentence, and we don't give all the details, even who said it. It's adequate, the state program, migrant program director. And then in paragraph 2, we put in all that other information, or in paragraph 2. So we we have the lead and the complete lead. The lead, get their interest, their attention. Paragraph 2, you finish your 5 W's. You have a summary of what the story is all about, and you move on. Now, in our case, in paragraph 2, we may mention the conference where this was said. We're all speaking at this conference. So the details of the conference, the name of the conference, and that was held at Xiamen University on such and such a date, could all be in paragraph 2. To finish the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where. And then this part is probably, something about why or something. To give some suggestion maybe, if we find that. There's lots of type of leads. And this, here's some here. I'm going to put this over here a little bit. So we have who leads, what leads, when leads, where leads, how leads, contrast leads, interview leads, cartridge leads, interpretive leads, all sorts of leads. As I mentioned, for our case, interview lead is or what I call the speech/interview lead, because it's essentially the same, is number 7. Tampa is lucky to be rid of former Mayor Dick Greco, his successor says. This actually was a lead that I wrote decades ago, and his successor was one of the mayors that got thrown out of office because he was criticizing a very popular mayor, and it was not a popular thing to do, was criticize Dick Greco, because he was very articulate, very handsome, he just left the office of mayor because he got a better offer in private enterprise. This is the cartridge lead. I said four-word lead. The president is dead. Bam. So a lot less than 15 words. That doesn't come along very often, but just making my point that leads can be very short. Get their attention. That's all you have to say. Interpretive lead. You might use an interpretive lead, but if you use an interpretive lead, your second paragraph better substantiate that interpretive lead, because there's no attribution in the interpretive lead. This is your opinion. And so you better provide some facts in paragraph 2 to support your opinion on this. So in this case, despite denials, and this is a news type interpretive lead, despite denials by Mayor Bill Bryce, recent activities suggest a political campaign is about to begin. Paragraph 2 then better suggest some of those activities, or very quickly. It might wait till paragraph 3, but very high in the story, you better come up with some evidence that your own opinion, your own interpretation, your own analysis is accurate. I don't recommend this very often, but of all the types of leads, probably in our class, 7 almost all your leads should be 7, the speech interview lead. You might get into 9, but you better get some evidence real high up if you have an interpretive lead. The others, not really appropriate for this class. So as I mentioned before, this is basically the complete lead, the 2 paragraphs, the lead, the complete lead. So the achievement gap is closing in Washington State, says the State Migrant Education Program Director. Paragraph 2, but education reform in the state is helping all classes of students do better on the state's WASL assessment, Dr. Richard Gomez says. It's kind of implied here that he is and this is frequently done in American journalism, that the fact that this came back immediately after this is your Migrant Education Program Director by its position and so forth. So that's a very frequent way of doing it. Just a descriptive sort of attribution here in the actual name in paragraph 2. Sometimes you can kind of think of, I mentioned here, think of the lead as your radio version. Radio news stories are always very short. And so this kind of your complete lead should kind of summarize what you're going to be talking about. You can kind of think about it as your radio version, your 2 to 3 paragraph radio version before you go into the rest of the story and make it your print version. So it should still, as I said, summarize what was said before you go on into the body of the story. So this then is the body of the story where it gives all the details, the direct quotes, and so forth. One thing that I should point out here is one of the options that I think should be about as rare as the interpretive lead in this class possible, but still I would discourage it, is a direct quote lead. A direct quote lead and a speech interview lead they sound kind of the same, and they're even organized the same, except the direct quote lead has quote marks. So it'd be written almost exactly like this. You put quote marks around the first clause there, and you have a direct quote lead. Now, the reason why I discourage it, or 2 reasons why I discourage you using a direct quote lead. One is and by the way, not just me. If you go into, I went through and I took the front page of 30-some daily newspapers in America. And I have that when you're in my editing class, you'll see all those pages. You'll be able to compare them, all from the same day. So you see what the newspaper, how they design and so forth. So if you take my editing class, you'll be able to see that. But the other thing I use it for sometimes, like in a news writing class or something, look at how often they do not use a direct quote lead. Because my students like to use direct quote leads. And I say, don't use it, and they keep using it. So I say, go look. In a professional newspaper, they almost never use a direct quote lead. And so if for no other reason, don't do it because nobody else does it. You'll be seen as the amateur if you do it. Same thing with a question lead. Don't use a question lead. A question lead can be quite effective if used not very often. If everybody uses a question lead, then it looks like, oh, we have a whole bunch of amateurs here. So you look in a daily newspaper and see if you find any question leads. Almost never. Almost never. Like one out of 1,000 leads, maybe in a professional newspaper might be a question lead. 1 out of 100 might be a direct quote lead. It's just not done. And so if that's the only reason, now there are other reasons too, but that's the only reason. If professionals don't do it, and you want to be a professional, don't do it, because they'll look at you as a non-professional. So question leads, don't use. Direct quote leads, avoid. Anyway, going back to why you don't, you can express it. You want to be able to direct the story, like I said, the lead leads, and you want it to be as powerful, that first sentence to be as powerful as possible, and to lead the direction you want it to go. A direct quote usually isn't perfect at that. It's good at other things. It gives personality, it gives credibility, but it doesn't say it exactly the way that you wish that he would have said it, to say exactly what you want to say, to lead the story, and to express itself in the most powerful way. Another reason is the direct quote is perfect for paragraph 3. Perfect. So very frequently what I do is I go through my notes and I look for all the best quotes, the direct quotes. And I say, wow, there's a great direct quote. That's my paragraph 3. And then I take that direct quote and I put it into my words, and that's my lead. So my lead is an indirect quote of the best quote. The best quote goes to paragraph 3. It's also useful. It's useful because not only, well, it brings, the body of the story is like the second version of the story. It gives all the details, like I said, maybe 30 paragraphs long. So it gives all the details of what you want to explain to somebody. And so if you have the short version, the radio version, and you have the long version right next to each other, you want them to start at the same place. You know, here's the short version, here's the long version. So how do you start them at the same place without being boring, without being redundant? Well, the lead of the body, so to speak, the first sentence of the body is your direct quote. And so now this says almost the same thing up here, but this is now a direct quote. All the ethnic groups close the achievement gap between themselves and the white students in last year's statewide WASL test, he says. White students, should be an S in there, students grew also, but ethnic students grew more. So now it just gives more detail of what was said in the lead. But I'm back at the same starting point to start the body of my story. This is called the bridge. The first sentence of the body of the story is now the bridge. It bridges from the complete lead into the body of your story to give the detail. And so you want to start at the same place anyway. And so indirect quote lead, direct quote bridge. I mentioned before that I'm a mathematician, right? I'm thinking like a mathematician. How do I figure out this formula? How do I figure out a formula that everybody's going to like and that I'm going to be seen as a really good reporter? This is part of the formula. Indirect quote lead, find basically summarizing the best direct quote I have, that direct quote becomes paragraph 3. And so it's very easy for me to go into my story looking through my notes, find the best quotes. You know, so it's not always necessarily the best quote in the sense of what sounds the best, if it has the best information in it and so forth, again, because I am thinking about what's most important in the story at the same time. And so, first off, let me say this. The lead is so important. There have been stories that I've written, I had to write under extreme deadline. Like I covered an accident one time, and our newspaper's deadline was supposed to be 12 o'clock. And at 12:30, we heard over the police radio that there was an accident and 5 people in a car that went into the river. And I ran out. All the reporters were gone. I was an editor. I ran out there to do that story. And I was stuck out there until after 1 o'clock. And our press starts running at 1:30. And so the decision by the editors was that we would take one of the stories off the front page and chase for the story I was going to write. But when I stepped in the room, they said, you have 10 minutes to write the story. Okay, so I had all the information. It took at least 5 of those 10 minutes to write the first sentence, because it leads, it's the most important sentence, and then everything else flows into place. So using a formula like this, even then it might take a few minutes to get your head wrapped around it, to make sure that lead is correct, and the indirect and the complete lead, even obviously more complete, and then that leads into the rest of your story. And you can, using that formula, you can write a front page story in 10 minutes. There's reason why I look at it mathematically. I have to do this quick, I have to do this well. And that's the formula, basically. And then I start going back and forth between quote, indirect, quote, and the rest of the story. I have to kind of go through my notes, and I may kind of put priorities. This will go first, second, third, fourth. I start going through. If it's multi-topic, then I go through first and I say this is topic A, topic B, topic A, topic B, topic C, topic D. I categorize the topics. I choose which topic is most important. I choose the quote that's best from that most important topic. That becomes my lead. The indirect quote of it becomes my lead. The direct quote becomes paragraph 3. The paragraph 2 might include a hint of the other topics that are going to be covered. Not totally, but maybe hint at more than one topic in this story. It's a more complicated story. And then I usually take them topic by topic, the most important. So topic A first, and then whatever topic is most important, or the next most important comes in after that, the next topic after that. So I go from topic. I also have to look, though, as I mentioned, how do I transition? So maybe it's not totally important, which is the most important, but how do I transition from topic A to topic B, and from topic B to topic C? So I may have to adjust that and say, well, topic C is really more important than topic B, but it doesn't transition. So I'm going to cover topic B next, and then go to topic C, just because I got to make the story has to flow. So, okay. So I talked the other day about the inverted pyramid, and so the idea of the inverted pyramid is the most important stuff at the top. And so your lead and complete lead should be the most important part of the story. That's at the top of the story, and you go to less and less important information. And then, as I said, very frequently in a printed newspaper, a printed newspaper will never include all of every story that it has. It will never do that. You're always going to be cutting. And so if you have to analyze a story to where to cut it, I don't want to cut the conclusion. You are going to delay your time for putting out in the newspaper by hours. If you're talking about 100 stories in the newspaper, you have to analyze each one so as not to cut the conclusion out of the story. You can't do that. And so inverted pyramid, and also, as I said, you can just cut anything. I'll cut here, cut here, cut here. Wherever I have to cut to fit it in, it may be a 30-inch story, and I cut it down to 3, possibly. Now that's an extreme, but that's possible. You have a 30-inch story, and you only have 3 inches of room. 3 inches. That's why your complete lead better be a complete lead. That's your radio. You just got your radio story into the newspaper. That's all I got there. So inverted pyramid. How did the inverted pyramid start? Remember? American Civil War, when they were blowing up telegraph lines. And the editor said, give us the most important stuff first. Before that, they were writing more like essays. They were writing like everybody else was writing, until the Civil War in America, when in order to get the most important stuff there first, that's what they had to tell the editors had to tell the reporters. Give us the most important stuff first. We don't know when the telegraph line is going to get blown up again. And lo and behold, the readers liked it better. They liked the most important stuff first. And so that became the primary journalistic style of all world journalism from the American Civil War. We went through this other day, but again, I decided to put it in this PowerPoint anyway. Maybe blow it up a little bit. This out of the way someplace. So again, the yellow is the lead paragraph. We went over the other day, marketing and PR in the 21st century are undergoing dramatic changes, says David W. Guth, an American public relations expert visiting Malaysia. So again, this is an example. Guth was something else I said, that you can use quotes from the textbook. Guth is the author of a PR textbook. And so I'm pretending that he was at the conference. He wasn't at the conference. His book was at the conference, I guess you could say. That's okay. You can quote him out of the book and pretend that he was at the conference. That's okay. Now, Guth isn't one of our authors, but our authors anyway. And then, again, the complete lead, adding the rest of the information. Guth was the keynote speaker for the conference, The Decline of Mass Marketing and the Rise of Consumer-Focused Marketing at Xiamen University Malaysia on June 15th. So give us the place, give us the conference title, give us this is the sort of paragraph 2 that I expect to finish those 5 W's. The who, what, when, where is all important in you're telling the story. Speakers at the conference also, so here's a multi-topic. This is a multi-topic story, so it's more than just what Gus said. And so another sentence in the complete lead, speakers at the conference also explain how mobile technology is quickly providing broadband internet access to the most remote villages around the globe, which is having, third topic, which is having a major impact on PR marketing as well as on world cultures. That's the third topic, world cultures. So this really has introduced 3 topics in one paragraph. And so you can do that. Use your complete lead to introduce more than one topic, and then you can that kind of, like I said, kind of helps you when you make that transition within the story. It will help you to do that smoothly because you've already introduced the subject. So if you've introduced the subject, then it's easier to then follow through. Okay, I need to jump from this subject. There's some other stuff here about, I talked about the other day, your direct quotes or the types of quotes, direct and indirect. You can look at this again, but there are 3 types of quotes, type 1, type 2, type 3. Type 1, attribution at the beginning. Dr. Gomez says, usually an indirect quote. Type 2, attributions at the end, says State Superintendent of Public Instruction Terry Bergeson. That's usually a direct quote because we want those quote marks to advise the reader that this is from somebody else, that it's not your opinion. Without those direct quotes, they'll think this is your opinion until you get to the very end, they'll get confused. So with especially a long direct quote, you can put it, you're safe at putting it at the end if it's a direct quote, but if it's a long indirect quote, you're not safe putting the attribution at the end because they'll get confused. They'll think you're writing your opinion. You don't want that to happen. So if it's a direct quote and long, you definitely want your attribution at the beginning. As I mentioned the other day, TV reporting puts attribution at the beginning almost all the time because people aren't reading it. They can't, they're hearing it. And so you want to alert them who's saying something right from the beginning, whether it's a direct quote or indirect quote, either way. In print, they have the quote marks you can see. So that type 3 then, the attribution's in the middle someplace. Whether or not, if it's two sentences that's tying together, then it's a period here. If it's one sentence that's splitting, then it'd be a comma there. So in this case, this is a separate sentence of this, so it's a period here. But it's still type 3 if the attribution in the paragraph is in the middle of the paragraph. Whether it's in the middle of a sentence or between sentences is not the point. Okay, went through that the other day. Again, you guys should go through the critique sheet. Let's talk about presentations. So if you had questions about presentations, so let's get to that. We don't have a lot of time, but I at least introduce that right now because you're thinking about that. Some of you have presentations coming up next week. So there's 4 parts to my critique. The quality of the visual aids, almost always PowerPoint. As I said, mentioned the other day, somebody used a different type of an online PowerPoint, and not PowerPoint, but something else. And that was a problem because we're recording on this computer, and so we need to be able to make a quick transition to your presentation. It needs to be on this computer, and so PowerPoint's the easiest way to do it. So don't think you have to be real fancy. I'm not going to be that impressed if you use something fancier than PowerPoint. Anyway, just stay with PowerPoint. It'll be easier transition. You plug in your USB drive, and we turn it on, and you're ready to go. But the quality of it, the contents of it, is going to be about 25% of your grade. The content, in the sense the graphic content. The information content will be another 25%. Have you chosen interesting stuff to present? Now, as I said, told some people the other day, that doesn't mean you cover the entire chapter. You're going to go through the chapter. You can't cover an entire chapter of either of these books in your 60 minutes maximum, or thereabouts. If there's 3 of you on a team, 20 minutes each, that's how do I get unplugged here? So there's no way, you're not going to cover the entire chapter. And so don't even think that you're going to cover the chapter. I wouldn't want you to anyway. I want you to get the most interesting stuff out of the chapter. Come up with something that will be relevant to everybody. So that the same as we're asking in a news story, the question in here is, so what also? So what? Why are we giving this presentation? So I want you to make a presentation that's interesting to people. And so you ask yourself as you prepare your presentation, so what? Why does anybody care about this information? And try to find stuff that people care about. If you find it totally boring, well, hopefully you can find something. Your job is to find something in that chapter that won't be boring to people. That's probably your first job. You do not want to present a boring presentation. You make a boring presentation, I can guarantee you won't get as good a grade as if you make an interesting presentation. That's probably the most important thing, because I also will get bored. If I get bored, then the grade's going to come down. Don't bore me, and don't bore your classmates. So go through your chapter and find something in there that you find not boring. And if you have to find additional graphics that make it, that to support that. And if somebody asks, can you go outside the book? Yes, you can. Don't make your entire presentation outside the book. But if you need some additional information in order to make it not boring, go find some additional information. That's fine. In fact, you'll be rewarded for that. That's actually part of critique number 4. But critique number 1, like I say, is quality of visuals. Critique 2 is quality of content. And a lot of that has to do with, these sort of questions. Enlighten, eliminate, exhibit, exemplify, examine. I think I mentioned the other day that I still remembered from a class I took decades ago as an undergraduate what a education professor taught, which was 4 ways to make sure that people really understand a concept. Number 1 was your definition. Don't stop there. Many of you will stop with definition. That's only the first out of 4 steps to understand a concept. Second, if you remember what second was, illustrate. That's partly why we have PowerPoint. Illustrate visually, but also your illustration may be verbally, in the sense that you can explain, like maybe show, if you're talking about leads, for example, show some examples of leads. If you're talking about bridges, show example of bridges. If you're talking about how to write a story, for example. So you show examples, that's illustration. Third is compare, what is it like? So how is a direct quote lead like a speech interview lead? How are they like? And how are they different? 4 things to really understand something. You need to definition, illustration, compare, and contrast. Now you can't do that with every concept that you're going to provide us in your presentation. But remember those things. If something is important, you need all 4 of those things to totally understand a concept. So that's in essence how this is built. Enlighten listeners with the best, most important, most interesting information. Eliminate unnecessary, uninteresting information. Exhibit graphic illustrations to enhance visual learners' understanding. Exemplify a concept with appropriate examples that epitomize that idea. Examine contrasting concepts. So basically that includes what I learned decades ago when I was your age. That's embedded within these questions that I've posed in this critique sheet. Now again, I'm not going to expect that you use all those things for every concept you teach. But if you use critical ones, what's going to jump out at me is if you introduce a very important concept and don't do enough of this for me to understand what you're talking about and for me to think that other people understood what you're talking about. Then that will, oops, ding, because I will know that that's one reason why other people will be getting bored. If you start defining concepts and not illustrating, comparing, and contrasting concepts, then people will become bored. They won't understand what you're talking about. So you need to think about that. We're out of time. Let me go down the last 2 parts then. Your delivery. I can't leave out delivery from your delivery of a presentation. So think about some of the things you need to do, like maybe excite your listeners with an interesting introduction. How are you going to catch their interest? It's just like writing the lead of a story. How are you going to catch their interest? In this case, you have actually more options. Interesting illustration, interesting question, interesting example. Find something interesting to catch their interest. Now, enunciate clearly. Obviously, that's important, so people can understand what you're saying. I can understand what you're saying. Emphasize important concepts in a way that makes them memorable. So again, that goes kind of back to those 4 parts of if it's going to be memorable. Illustration would be part of that, for example. Explain the concepts clearly. So again, we're going back to those 4 concepts again. You're explaining it clearly. Extend your eye contact. Look at people. Too many of the students last semester were just read. You'll get a better grade if you're less perfect and don't read. Because I'm going to be looking for the eye contact, because not just eye contact. Your eye contact also leads to keeping people's attention. You're looking at them. You can see if they have questions. Their eyes look like, I don't understand. You can elaborate where you didn't even plan to, but you see people don't understand. So you can explain a little bit better. You can express yourself better when you're not, it's not as precise, you're right, but you can express yourself in a more animated way, a more excited way. You can just express yourself more humanly. And if you're reading in a monotone and just reading this after this after this, and you're reading it, everybody goes to sleep. There's no emphasis to anything. You have to emphasize. And so it's really, what I sometimes do, if I want to be fairly precise, I write it out, and then I don't read it. I write it out, and then I put notes. PowerPoint is a way of making notes. You should not use complete sentences in PowerPoint, but just short notes on each idea, each concept, a short, bullets, short bullets. And let that follow, and if you want to be as precise, then read and even to some degree memorize what you've written, but go from the bullets. And don't think you have to be precise in your expression. Don't worry too much about the grammar. That's if you have people's attention, you've got their eye contact, you're expressing yourself. Precision is not as important as your ability to express and keep people's interest and looking at them and conversing with them. You're talking to them. You're not just reading something. So you're going to get the best grade if you can do that. Now, if you have to read it, that's okay. I don't grade these real hard, but the truth is you'll get a better grade if you don't read it. Even though you're less precise, you may be less complete, you will get a better grade if you don't read it. You show more enthusiasm, more energy when you don't read, and so forth. And finally, try to, if you can, end with something memorable. Again, it can be a variety of things, an example, an illustration, something to help people remember the end of it. That will be powerful. The last thing then, very quickly, sorry I'm delaying you again. Besides being on time, you need to give me a copy, electronic copy, preferably a printed copy, so I can take notes on it and I can do a better job of grading you. If you've printed out a copy just in the, even six slides per paper, that's fine. I can follow along. I can make sure I know who's talking. I don't get confused at who's the speaker. I can remember that. I also can remind myself, how many illustrations did they use? Did they use good illustrations? I may myself kind of lose track of that. If I have your printed PowerPoint, even again 6 items per page, I can kind of say, okay, yeah, they could have used more illustrations here. No, they were fine. You weren't thinking right. The other thing is and then I do need electronic because that's going to go on to the Moodle site for everybody to access. Did they use sources beyond that which is required? So that goes back to the question somebody asked, can you use other sources? The answer is yes. In fact, you'll get bonus points for it. It's kind of like extra credit. Particularly if, for example, you're kind of localizing it or you're customizing it in some way that makes it more interesting, for all of you for some reason. If you can come up with a way, again, it's not a major point, but if you do, I make note of it. The students who did something a little extra there was only one person that got a perfect grade, and she definitely went outside the textbook last semester. Anyway, so updating might be part of it too. These textbooks may be a little bit outdated, so if you update, that's a way of getting outside information because now you have more current information. That's, I think, what that gal that got a perfect grade did was she updated and got more recent statistics than were in the textbook. Anyway, finally, questions. So like each person should come up with like 3 questions, 3 objective questions, multiple choice questions for their part of the presentation. So if there's 2 of you presenting, that's 6 questions altogether. 3 of you presenting, that's 9 questions altogether. Each person, 3 questions. You'll be graded individually, but it is, the better you do as a group, probably the better impression it gives me for each individual. I can't say it won't influence me. So the group presentation, the way you put it together is important, but to the degree possible, I'm grading you individually on your presentation, on all these factors, including your questions. So these 4 aspects are the ones I just presented. Your extra effort, including the questions, your actual delivery, your contents, your information contents, and your visual contents. Those are 4 items. Any questions on that? Yeah.
The questions are asked during the presentation or at the end?
At the end of well, you could do it during it if you wanted to, but in mind I had just you putting the questions at the end and reviewing them very quickly at the end of the presentation. So in that case, you'd have to maybe switch speakers again to, so you're giving your presentation, then number one comes up and asks her questions or presents her questions. The second presenter presents her questions, and if there's a third presenter, then presents her questions. And review with the, give the right answer. But I don't want you actually to mark, no, yes I do. Yeah, go ahead and mark the right answer on this. I may not put the answers onto the Moodle. I want you to pay enough attention that you get the answers in class. Because there will be some quizzes during the semester too. And these may be in the quiz. I want you to actually, I don't want you to just cram in the last minute. I want you to be paying attention during class, basically. I want to give you a reason to listen in class. And so listen for the answers, because I may take the answers off of the questions when they go on to the Moodle. So you'll have the questions, but if you didn't listen in class, you may not have the answers. So, okay? Any other questions? Okay, we covered a lot of stuff today. Hopefully you kind of get a better idea of what I'm looking for in your stories and in your quizzes and in your presentations. Thank you.